On one sunny afternoon, Rudeus is out exploring his local village, when suddenly he runs into a group of bullies, who are pelting mud balls at a young boy because his green hair marks him as a demon. As one of the bullies goes to escalate the violence by picking up a stone, Rudeus hurriedly intervenes by using his magic to throw water balls at the bullies. Frustrated by Rudeus's challenge, the bullies walk away from the situation. After Rudeus uses his magic to clean the young boy, the two spend the rest of their day together, sitting under a tree on a hill and practicing magic. With the day gone by, Rudeus returns home to find his father Paul furious, demanding that he apologize for punching a kid while he was out in the town. We know that this never happened, that a lie or misinterpretation of the bullying conflict had reached Paul's ear, and that Rudeus was completely, 100% in the right for defending the victim with his harmless water balls. Nonetheless, Paul chastises Rudeus, not letting him explain his side of the story at all, while preaching values that Rudeus should be following, that when you've done something wrong, the first thing you do is apologize. This is not wisdom from a wise character that is supposed to resonate with the audience. In this context, we are unequivocally positioned to be on Rudeus's side. He has done nothing wrong and is being unfairly chastised. Rudy retorts to Paul that adults have it easy. They can yell at a kid before he even has a chance to explain himself. Then Paul hits Rudy, and the dynamic completely changes. Paul is shocked by what he did, and Rudy calmly reprimands him for it, telling his father how he has worked so hard to earn his trust, and that shouting and hitting him before he can explain himself is a terrible thing to do. Paul, starting to clamor in an attempt to salvage his side of the argument, finally asks Rudeus to explain his side of the story. In response, Rudeus sarcastically and condescendingly retorts that the next time he sees 3 kids gang up on one helpless victim, he'll join in so that everyone knows what kind of people are in the Grey Rat family. At this point, Paul realizes that he has completely fumbled this entire confrontation and apologizes to Rudeus. This Paul-Rudy argument is the most interesting scene in the Buena Village arc of Mushoku Tensei, but it tends not to get the appreciation it deserves, and is largely overshadowed by the more famous Paul-Rudy argument much later in the story. So in this video, I'm going to try and convince you of why it's so great. The first and most obvious reason is the catharsis. We've all been in situations as kids where adults put their foot down, even though you know you've done nothing wrong, but they just won't listen to you. And Rudeus is able to turn around such a situation and chastise the adult for their ill behavior. It's a joy to watch, and it's very cathartic, but the scene is certainly much more than that. There's also a unique inversion of the father-son dynamic. We follow the perspective of the 5-year-old son, whose mental age of 39 exceeds that of his 24-year-old father. This son imbues a lesson on the father about hearing people out before jumping to conclusions, a lesson that would usually be expected of the father to his son. Framing Rudeus as the symbolic father, the purveyor of important lessons onto the young and flawed Paul, serves 2 important roles. Firstly, it creates the character of Paul, who up until this point was essentially a placeholder figure in the backdrop of Rudeus's life, a cardboard cutout of a stereotyped dad in a fantasy world. This new framing of Paul as the flawed figure, closer to his son than to Rudeus's father, thrusts Paul into becoming a real character, who will have his own arc in the grander story. Throughout this argument, we see him display nuanced emotion for the first time ever. His expression, a mix of anger, panic, sadness, and regret, conveys that he is someone who is dealing with something internally, and it clues us into the fact that there's more depth to him than we had assumed up to this point. And on revisiting the scene with the additional context of the rest of the season, and even more context through his post-argument point of view chapter in the light novel, this depth is very clear. We see a young father who had his first child unplanned at the age of 19, who has silently been struggling with feelings of inadequacy in raising an intellectual prodigy of a son that he feels unqualified to be a father of. A man who hated his own father for being too stern and prideful, and ran away from home as a result, now forced to see the mirror of his father in his own actions toward Rudeus in this argument, with the irony being that he only acted so sternly because he finally felt like he had the chance to prove himself a good father for once. He was glad to be given an opportunity to prove himself qualified as a parent by disciplining Rudeus, but through his attempt to do so, he feels the echo of his own father and feels even worse than if he had done nothing at all. The scene's characterization of Paul as a struggling, flawed, and immature person, alongside Paul's retrospective reflection on his mishandling of the situation, firmly establishes him as a point of view character, reframing all of his past appearances and forever changing how we see him going forward. This is the scene that created Paul Greyrat, one of the best characters in the entire Mushoku Tensei story. Now, putting aside the creation of Paul, the inverse son-father dynamic also serves another purpose. It establishes a baseline to highlight Rudeus' stagnation. 6 years after the initial bullying conflict, Rudy attempts to save a young boy from being kidnapped. But as it turns out, this young boy is none other than the young bully Somal from all those years ago. The kid whose false story of Rudeus attacking him misled Paul and seeded the initial Paul-Rudy argument. Somal's presence at this much later point in the narrative creates a symbolic bridge between the argument those many years ago and the far more famous Paul-Rudy argument in Millis following the teleportation incident. Confused as to why Rudeus hasn't seen his message, Paul asks him to explain his journey following the teleportation incident. Rudeus, not paying any mind to the tension in the room, or Paul's increasingly angry disposition in response to his words, retells his journey through the Demon Continent, framing his retelling through a joyous lens. Midway through the story, Paul snaps and accuses Rudeus of playing around on his journey. He is clearly angry for some reason unknown to Rudeus, yet despite this, he still gives Rudeus the chance to explain himself, by asking him why he didn't seek out the other victims of the teleportation incident. Paul has clearly internalized the lesson that the first argument taught him all those years ago. In response to Paul's inquiry, Rudeus has no good answer, so Paul starts digging into him, mocking Rudeus for using the teleportation incident as an opportunity to get with Eris. At this point, Rudeus snaps right back into the sarcastic and condescending approach to arguing that he used back in their first argument, accusing Paul of cheating on Zenith and Lilia by sleeping with the women around him, an accusation that, unbeknownst to Rudeus, is blatantly false. Rudeus very clearly believes himself to be on the right side of this argument, once again seeing himself as the symbolic father in their dynamic, teaching Paul a lesson about hypocrisy. Then Paul hits Rudy. But this time, Paul doesn't back down, because Rudy is no longer the metaphorical father in their relationship. He isn't the wiser person pointing out Paul's hypocrisy in this situation. Rudy is the one who fails to inquire as to the struggles Paul has gone through. He doesn't give Paul the benefit of the doubt like he had told Paul to give him all those years ago. If he had inquired as to Paul's perspective, then he would have realized that Paul's disgruntled and snarky response to Rudeus's joyous retelling of his epic fairy tale on the Demon Continent was quite justified. Teleported to the middle of an open field, with nothing but the clothing on his back, Paul became a dependable father. He kept Norn safe and raised her all on his own, all the while doing his best to save those lost during the teleportation incident. He became a reliable leader of a company trying to return those displaced during the mass displacement and amassed a mass of people who loved and respected him. But at the same time, he sank deeper and deeper into depression and fell harshly into alcoholism as he seemingly failed on every turn to reunite his family that was instantly broken by the natural disaster equivalent that was the teleportation incident. He became a good father, but at the same time became an understandably very broken man. And Rudeus accuses him of betraying the memory of his family, whom he has fought every day to revive. In their first argument, Rudy was the wiser person, using his wit to show Paul that he should listen to Rudeus's perspective. He takes it a bit too far with the sarcasm and condescension, but it's excusable because the truth is on Rudeus's side. But in this situation, he does what Paul did to him and doesn't consider his perspective. Paul took the lesson and internalized it, but Rudeus hasn't matured at all. So that's it. The initial Paul-Rudy argument all the way back in Buena Village ripples throughout the remainder of the story. It's cathartic, it has a unique son-father dynamic, creates the character of Paul, and is a great foundation to show that in some aspects, Rudeus hasn't grown much at all.